guys, it's Erin, and today I am going to tell you about my favorite books of 2018. I actually kind of wavered about how many I was going to talk about because I read a lot of books. It was a really good reading year for me, and so it was hard to narrow the list down, but I did to 10, and I feel pretty good about this 10. I feel like these are 10 of the books that I really loved, that I still think about even though I've read most of these a while ago. They're ones that I think about having read, and some of them are ones that I think are going to be influential to me personally as time goes on. With that, my first book on the list and my favorite of the year was George Eliot's Middlemarch. I just love this book so much. So I feel like I've talked about this book a lot on my channel. It was in my mid-year favorite books list, for example, and I think in a wrap-up. And anyway, the plot is kind of hard to discuss because it's so kind of detailed and complicated. This is a really long story. Basically, it's just about people and their experience in this town called Middlemarch in the 1830s and the kind of like highs and lows and joys and pains of their kind of not growing up so much as just like, yeah, growing up, but they're already adults, they're not kids, but you know, adults grow up too. What's really brilliant about the story, like, I enjoyed the plot, but it's a classic novel. It's not exactly a page-turner thriller or something. What makes it so brilliant is the characterization. The characters are just so incredibly real and vividly drawn and just beautiful and excellent. It's fantastic. The good characters have serious flaws, just like real people, and the characters you don't like so much have positive qualities, just like real people. And I really appreciated that kind of affirmation of the value of trying to see other people for who they really are and to find the good in them, and to even draw that out of them, because, you know, the world's kind of a mess and we're not doing a very good job of that. I also really liked the questions that Eliot was exploring, questions of marriage, questions of religion and vocation and faith. She's wondering, how can you live a kind of faithful, religious life in a country and a time when that is becoming increasingly less important. England's not quite so much a Christian nation anymore, but how can you still maintain some of those kind of principled ideas and still do good in the world, even kind of outside of the traditional past view of what the church used to do that? How do you do that now? And then also, I just love Eliot's voice. The narrator makes comments, little asides, she'll kind of explain something to us. She makes little comments about the characters, which are just kind of humorous and enjoyable. So it's fun to also kind of get to know the narrator a little bit as she tells us the story about these people. She acknowledges some complaints, like, why are we always talking about Dorothea? She explains it. So I liked that part of it too. The second book on my list and my second favorite read of the year was The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. This book is about two cousins, Joe Kavalier and Sam Clay. They meet for the first time in New York when Joe Kavalier manages to immigrate from Prague, where he has kind of been the only one in his family to escape the encroaching Nazi threat, and kind of like sails through a loophole after it closes, almost. And Sam is thrilled to have his cousin come and live with him. They're about the same age, and he's especially thrilled when he discovers that Joe is a really good artist. And this is the very beginning of the golden age of comic books, and Sam recognizes a good business move when he sees it. So he combines his creative talent for storytelling with his cousin's talent for artistry, and together they start a comic book called about the Great Escapist. And the story is about them kind of founding this comic book. It talks about their business ups and downs, a kind of triumph of their first success and all of that, which is really fun. But it's also just about the boys as they grow up. Joe has to deal with having a really good life in New York. He is making money, the comic book is very successful, he meets this young woman that he falls in love with and has a relationship with, but at the same time, his family is dying in Europe, and he knows that it's unlikely that he'll be able to get anyone over, but he really, really is trying to get his brother to come over to America and be able to escape Europe before things get really terrible. And so he has this almost kind of like survivor's guilt that he has to deal with. And Sam is super outgoing, he's super energetic, he kind of, like I said, has all of these crazy ideas that somehow work. But he is learning that he's not attracted to women like his cousin is, and kind of grappling with what that means for him and for his chances at happiness in the 1930s. So it is, on the surface, kind of a historical fiction story about these two young boys who start a comic book and find success, but really it's about these two really interesting people who are growing up amidst some personal and kind of national and global hardships, and how they individually kind of deal with these problems. It's a little bit whimsical, it's a little bit not improbable, but it's it's got a little bit of a touch of comic book in it already, that kind of like traditional comic book narrative where things are slightly implausible but still kind of make sense. We get told some of the stories of the comic that they invent, which is really awesome. I think there's actually a volume of the comic itself that came out after the book was published, and the book actually takes place over 10 or 20 years ultimately, and I also really liked that because we got to see how the events in the couple of years in the 1930s impact the rest of the lives of these men. And I think Chabon did an excellent job of showing us the characters getting older but still staying true to themselves. So they were able to change, but through all of that they stayed the same person. They were still recognizable as themselves. And I don't know that I've seen that happen very often in stories where there's a big age shift. Either I feel like the characters maybe don't grow quite as much as they probably would have in real life, or they change so much that you almost don't recognize them. Really, really great. Definitely deserved winning the Pulitzer Prize, and I've gone on to read some other things by Michael Chabon and really enjoyed them as well. So I highly recommend this book. So the last two books were my top two, basically, reads of the year. The rest of these aren't really ranked. They're just kind of like listed. They're sort of grouped loosely by category. Top two, everything else in sort of like a slush pile. But anyway, the next book that I want to talk about is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I devoured this book. It actually took me a little while to get into it, but once I kind of realized what it was working towards, I was more interested and I stuck with it. And so after the first like 60 pages, I got really hooked. I actually stayed up like super late to finish this and read it really quickly, which is unusual for me to do with classics. I'll do it with like a fantasy or a really interesting contemporary or something, but usually classics take me a little bit longer to read. This one just hooked me and I could not put it down. So the frame and the place where I stumbled a little bit is told from the perspective of a young man named Gilbert Markham. He's a young English gentleman farmer, and he lives in this small community which is left when this young woman and her young son move into Wildfell Hall. She's very mysterious. It's clear that she is not using her own name and that she wants to keep her identity and her location a secret from somebody, but nobody really knows what. And Gilbert and this woman named Helen eventually kind of become friends. He's very attracted to her, but she kind of repulses any romantic attempts that he makes and is like, no, I really like you, but we just need to be friends. And then some rumors start to spread about her and some of the things that people are saying she's doing, and Gilbert is really upset and he goes and kind of confronts her about those things, and she, to kind of explain what's actually happening, she gives him her journal. And then most of the rest of the story is actually from her journal, and the story really focuses on Helen and her experience. And I didn't realize that, and that's the part that got really, really interesting. So Helen, when she's young, she chooses to marry this man who she sees is a little flawed, but she has that kind of like starry-eyed, oh, I can save him thing, and quickly realizes that she can't, because he doesn't want to be saved. He's perfectly content with the way his life is now, and he does not want to change. So Helen has to kind of deal with coming to terms with that, and then also coming to terms with how she's supposed to live with this guy. He cuts her off from her family. He's verbally abusive. He's an alcoholic. He's an adulterer, and she knows it. And she kind of just like has to put up with this because of course she can't get a divorce, and where would she go? So she kind of just deals with it, and I really admire her moral strength in holding true to her own principles when she could have very easily become more like him in the company that he kept. One of his friends keeps asking her to start an affair with him, and she's like, no, I'm gonna be faithful to my husband, thanks. So that's just like it's a really interesting, really compelling story. It was totally new and kind of shocking when it came out, and I think it's still a really relevant story today. Super compelling and fascinating story about this woman, the tenant of Wildfell Hall. Next is a book of poetry. This is the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. It's very slim. The Four Quartets are one of Eliot's later works, and they're written in 4 sections, each one named after a place that Eliot visited and that was important to him. It's kind of hard to describe what the Four Quartets is about, and if you haven't ever read poetry, then I don't recommend that you start with this one. It's rough. And I took an entire class on T.S. Eliot, so it's not like I'm not familiar with his style. It's really challenging, but I found the challenge to be really rewarding, and I'm glad that I picked it up and dove into it. I actually read the first section of the poem called Burnt Norton in that Eliot class, and I had no idea what was going on. I found that it made more sense read all together. So each of the 4 sections is a little bit different, but all together they're considering ideas of the kind of like incarnational time. How can something have happened in a particular time, but also out of time, and also impact all of time? So he's thinking about the present, the future, the past, things that haven't happened, things that will happen. How does that all work? And that's a really complicated and fuzzy topic anyway, and then Eliot does it in a way that's more impressionistic than prescriptivist. He's not explaining what's going on, he's just thinking about the ideas, and he's using a variety of different images and narrative pieces to try to talk about them. So I think it really helps if you go into the story or the poem not expecting him to say anything definite, but kind of to go on a journey with him to explore this really complicated idea. And I think what I really liked about it is, first of all, I kind of was able to get that out of the poem, whereas like I said before, just reading the first section, I had no idea what it meant. I really liked it. I thought it was beautiful. And the poetry in here is just really beautiful. Definitely Eliot at like the height of his poetic power. What I really liked about it is that kind of deep contemplation and that invitation to just kind of sit and think about this really crazy, complicated subject with him in some really creative and beautiful ways. So that's kind of what I really liked about the poem. If you have read a lot of poetry, or you've read some of T.S. Eliot and liked it and just haven't read the Four Quartets, I highly recommend it. The way that I read this is that I read each section twice and then moved on to the next section and read it twice, and so on through the poem, and then I went back and I read the whole thing again. It's really short, so that might have taken me an hour to do all of that, but I found that I absorbed more with that kind of cyclical repetition. So you might want to try it like that, or just plan to reread it a couple of times, because you definitely don't get a whole lot on the first blush. It's the like second and third pieces where you start to see kind of how all of it comes together, where it starts to really click and make sense. Maybe I'll do a video about reading poetry. Next is the Odyssey by Homer. This is the most recent read that's on this list. The translation by Emily Wilson is what made it onto this list, because I've read the Odyssey several times before, because I have taught it to various age groups. The Odyssey is one of the oldest works in Western civilization. It's really important because of its long influence. This is a story about Odysseus. He is trying to get home from the Trojan War which has taken 10 years, and it takes him another 10 years to get home. Along the way, he has a lot of different adventures and meets some mythical creatures, including the sirens and Cersei, and he visits the dead, and a lot of those tropes and ideas and creatures are common to our Western language. For example, the symbol on the front of the Starbucks cup, that's a siren. It's also the story about his wife and son, who for the last 4 years have had some trouble because everybody else has decided that Odysseus is dead, and a lot of people want to marry, or a lot of men want to marry Penelope, his wife. And she's kind of keeps trying to put them off, but they have become a problem because instead of doing what they're supposed to, which is court her from a distance and send things to her and be like, hey, you're beautiful, and then like go visit and then leave, they've all just decided that they're gonna stay. They're like, we're gonna hang out here every day until you pick one of us to marry. And that has become a strain on their household because it costs a lot of, not money, because they didn't have money, costs a lot of sheep to feed and house all of these people. So that's kind of the gist of the story, and to be honest, I enjoyed it and I recognized its importance to Western literature, but I didn't really care about it one way or the other until I read Emily Wilson's translation. This is just stunning and brilliant. She, I don't want to say simplified the language, but translators for a long time have had a tradition of bulking out the language a little bit, making it kind of falsely archaic, so it sounds sort of old-fashioned and important, and padding out descriptions and stuff, and kind of showing off their skill as a poet slash translator. And Wilson kind of stripped all of that out. Her translation is the same length as the original Greek poem, which is unusual. Usually the translations are longer than the original Greek poem. She wrote it in iambic pentameter, which has got a nice rhythm to it and helps you kind of move through the poem. And the result of her translation choices is a beautiful translation that I think heightens the interest in the story. There were a lot of places that I got to where I was like, oh, this is the boring part, and then it wasn't. It was interesting, and I think that is just such a gift to this poem. Because if that's what it's really like, then, how wonderful it is that she sort of opened that up to a whole new audience, or even an old audience like me that kind of is able to reevaluate the poem. She also made some translation choices that are more accurate to the poem, but maybe offended our contemporary sensibilities and made the heroes look worse or something. So sometimes there were some adjectives used to describe various creatures that made them sound worse than they really were, and translators did that to make Odysseus look better, but she's like, that's not actually the connotation of the word that was actually used, so I'm gonna make it more neutral, which makes the poem a little bit more complicated, and she kind of deals with that in her introduction and her translator's note, which are definitely worth reading. She also did things like, people tended to translate some words into English words like domestic servant, or household servant, or maiden, or maidservant, or something like that, but the Greek words all indicate slaves, and she's like, guys, we need to acknowledge that the ancient Greek world was swimming with slavery. It was a very deeply slave culture, and so she uses the word slave and things like that. I really appreciate that she's super attentive to the original poem. She's very aware of the tradition of translation, and she did her best to kind of represent the poem for a modern audience. Also, just as a final note, something that I really appreciated seeing, although since I've read the poem several times I didn't really need it, was the notes in the back. Each book has a paragraph that's a summary of what happens in that book. I know that having read that for the first time, having that in the back of the book would have been so helpful. Speaking of the Odyssey, my next book on this list is Cersei by Madeline Miller. This is the same Cersei who shows up in the Odyssey, and Odysseus shows up in Cersei, but this is kind of almost like a biography of Cersei, who's this mythical creature and never actually existed, of course. It's told in first person, beautifully, in wonderful, just lush, lyric, stunning prose. Miller is a classicist, and so she knows quite a lot about Being a classicist, it means that she's a scholar. She has a PhD in the classics and studies ancient Greece and stuff. Her academic knowledge grounds this story in a really interesting way. I think that it makes it seem just, I guess I use the word grounded, and that's kind of what I mean. It's grounded. It feels very realistic because she understands all of the little nuanced cultural things and details that she can add based on her knowledge of the ancient world that just help make the story seem more real, even though it's about an immortal goddess. Cersei is born to Hyperion, the god of the sun, and she grows up in his court with her other siblings, and she's kind of like the smallest, plainest, least interesting person around. But this enables her to become an observer, and she really does spend a lot of her life just observing. But she discovers some latent powers that are unusual, and her powers combined with her defiance and kind of clear dislike for the way that the gods kind of exist leads her to be banished to this island. And the rest of the story just kind of talks about her coming to terms with who she is, learning about herself, about her power, and it's just a really interesting book. I really loved the experience of reading it. I know it's one that I will revisit. It was quiet and thoughtful like Cersei, and I think that Miller did a great job of honoring the traditions while telling a really fresh and modern story. It was fantastic. Okay, the next book I don't have because I checked it out from the library. I would love to buy it someday, and the next time I decide to reread it, I probably will purchase a copy, but that was The Babel Stacks by Natasha Pulley. This is about a young man named Merrick Tremaine who has been invalided out of the British East India Company. He was kind of like a smuggler slash botanist for them, and was in an accident and hurt his leg, and they kind of were like, well, you're not useful anymore. Except an old friend of his comes and he is asked to take part in one more expedition. The British East India Company, of course, is in the East Indies, specifically India, and they're having a problem with malaria, but they don't have a lot of access to the trees that make quinine, which is the only kind of treatment for malaria. And so they ask Merrick to take part in this expedition to get cuttings of the trees from Peru, which is technically illegal, and so they will have to smuggle things out. Merrick is asked because of his experience with trees and with smuggling, but also because his family has connections in Peru, and he kind of has like an excuse for being there. For various reasons, Merrick kind of ends up reaching this place where his family, his father and grandfather had visited in Peru, a town called New Bethlehem, and more or less alone. And he spends some time with the local priest, a man named Raphael, who kind of like takes him in and starts to realize that there's something a little different with New Bethlehem. The story has a magical realist twist that's really beautiful and lovely and interesting. And the story, although it's still about smuggling and there's plenty of action, really kind of becomes about relationships and about Merrick becoming close to this Raphael, and also just about him learning exactly what this different thing that surrounds New Bethlehem is all about. It was really interesting, and I'm being really mysterious, but I don't want to give anything away because we don't learn about what is going on until we're like 2/3 of the way through the book, so that would definitely be a spoiler. Again, really beautiful writing, really interesting characters, and just like so worth reading. The next book I also got to the library and is the beginning kind of my fantasy section a little bit, and that was The Tiger and the Wolf by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This story is about a young girl named Manie. Her father is a clan chieftain of the Wolves, and he wants to become like head chieftain. And Manie learns that he plans to do this by kind of using her as a tool for politics and stuff. And she decides that she doesn't really want to do that, so she runs away. And in running away, becomes involved with some of the broader things that are happening, both in her own region, which is called the Crown of the World, and also in the Sunlands to the south, or the land of the rising sun. I can never remember what it's called. Anyway, the southern place. Tchaikovsky, this is a trilogy, and I am actually currently reading the second book right now, and I can see now, having begun the second book, how Tchaikovsky is set up a bigger story in the first book. So there are details and threads and things that keep kind of popping up, and you're not quite sure how they're going to come together, but I'm starting to see that now. The story starts with Manier, but it quickly kind of collects a lot of different characters with different personal goals and things that they want and need. And I did enjoy the story and the characters, and it's been fun to kind of revisit them. But what really made this book for me is the world. It is a really, really interesting fantasy world that's just like stunningly detailed. I'm just so blown away by the detail of the world and how carefully thought out it was, and how intricate and nuanced it is. Tchaikovsky has done a great job of imagining a really complex kind of tribal network of peoples, all who are a little bit different, who have slightly different customs, who have different ways of seeing the world, and it's just so impressive. In this kind of unnamed fantasy world, the peoples are very tribal, and each tribe is named after a animal, and that's because that tribe can shift into that animal. So Manier is from the wolf tribe, and she can shift into a wolf, and a secret that she doesn't tell anyone is that she, her mother was from the tiger clan, and she can also shift into a tiger, which is unusual. It's very unusual for somebody to be able to shift into two different animals, and that is actually like a problem because the two are kind of like fighting for dominance within her. In addition to tigers and wolves, there are hyenas and horses and lions and deer and serpents and bears and owls, and just like so many different groups, and those different clans, like I said, are just like all so interesting and well developed, and it was just a really interesting world. So that's kind of why this one has made the list. If you like fantasy and are looking for something that's really unique and different, I would definitely recommend that. This fantasy is not different. It's a very classic kind of traditional fantasy, but I still really, really loved it. This is Sabriel by Garth Nix, and my book is getting ripped. That is sad. Sabriel is about a girl named Sabriel. She has grown up going to boarding school in this country called Ancelsis Tier, which is hard to say, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but her kind of small world is divided into two. There's Ancelsis Tier, which is kind of like has a like not quite World War I Edwardian sort of English feel to it. Old-fashioned a little bit, but with modern technology somewhat, and mostly no magic. To the north of the wall is the Old Kingdom, which is deeply magical, and that is where Sabriel is from. Her father is the Aborsin, which is a kind of, it's a name and a role in the Old Kingdom, and on her 18th birthday he doesn't show up, and he's never not shown up before, so Sabriel knows that something is wrong, and she travels into the Old Kingdom to find her father, eventually partnering with a cat named Mogget, who is the best. He's just great. And a young man that she awakens from a magical sleep named Touchstone, and together they go in search for her father and realize that his disappearance is tied up with the problems that the Old Kingdom is having. For example, it hasn't had a monarch for a long time, and so just like a lot of things are kind of falling apart politically and socially and also magically. This was just like such a great old school fantasy. It's not enormously long, but the story is really well told and engaging. It's got plenty of action, but it's not like too much. We still get plenty of time to just watch Sabriel learn and grow. It hovers on the border between adult and YA. Officially, it's an adult fantasy, but definitely would be appropriate for teenagers to read. It's just like an all-around quality, solid fantasy. I have gotten the rest of the trilogy and am really looking forward to finishing it this year. The next book, I cheated a little bit. It's Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor and Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. I'm counting this as one because it is one story. So Strange the Dreamer is about a young man named Laszlo Strange. He is an orphan. He was raised by a group of monks, I think, and from the time he was young, he's been really interested in this city that is known as Weep. It is kind of almost become a mythical city. It was really famous and really like advanced, and people were really always amazed when they like traded with Weep or traveled to Weep. But about 200 years ago, just like all communication from the city shut off and nobody knows what's happened to it. And then when Laszlo is a young boy, already kind of obsessed with Weep and their famed special elite forces, like military forces, suddenly the name of the city just like disappears from everybody's memory, kind of by magic, and it becomes called Weep. And still nobody knows what has been going on. And then Laszlo grows up. He becomes a librarian at his nation's kind of like main library. It's the archival library. There's lots of old material, and Laszlo loves books, but he is especially excited because he can learn all he can about Weep, and he does. He pieces together the language from old documents. He's like hardcore obsessed. And then one day, a delegation of people arrive from Weep. They are like, hey, guess what? We're still here. Also, we have a problem with our city, and we need people to come and try to solve this problem. And so they're going through kind of the major cities of the world and collecting people who have skills that might be able to help them solve this problem that they aren't explaining. Laszlo does not get picked as part of the delegation. I kind of like that. He's not the chosen one. He happens to know the language, so he's able to communicate with the people, and then he becomes friends with the leader and is just kind of like invited to go along because he's a nerd, and sometimes that pays off. So that's the kind of like first third of Strange the Dreamer, and they travel to Weep. We get to know some of the delegates who like continue to be a part of the story, and then we get to Weep and we find out what the problem is, and everybody realizes that it's a little more complicated than they thought, and they start to understand what has been going on with Weep for the last 200 years, and it's a deep emotional scar on the society. The book, really, its major themes are questions about how you can recover from a long period of kind of national oppression, of violence, and just like tragedy and heartbreak. It asks if it's ever possible to break a cycle of violence and revenge, and if so, how do you do that? I think these are really, really important questions to be asked, and I think that they're explored in a really interesting and legitimate way that doesn't diminish the deep pain that all of the things that have happened in Weep have caused, but also has a hopeful look ultimately. It is YA. Be aware that there's sort of like the last third of the book has a lot of romance in it, which kind of quiets down a little bit in the second half of the story, but is kind of like important that it happened. Also, I really just love Laszlo. He is a hero, but he's a hero because he's kind and compassionate, and he's good at listening to people and talking to them, and he knows how to connect with other people and like draw them out and help them almost understand themselves better. He's brave and courageous and virtuous, but not in a like, let's go into battle and fight all the things kind of way, although he can do that if he feels like he needs to. He reminds me a little bit of Faramir, actually, from The Lord of the Rings, just a little bit. And I really just like that those qualities, which you don't often see as kind of being praised in fantasy, especially in young adult fantasy, are what become important and are the things that matter for Laszlo as a main character and as a hero. So that ended up being dramatically longer than I thought it was going to be. I actually refilmed this because the other one was too long, and so anyway, if you stuck with me through this whole thing, thank you. I am so glad that you did. Like I said, I had a really great reading year. I really enjoyed a lot of the books that I read. I will link my 2018 year in review down below if you'd like to see all of the books that I read and what I rated them. I do tend to rate things kind of high, but anything that was a 4- or 5-star read was definitely one that I really liked and would recommend. I would love to hear in the comments what some of your favorite reads of 2018 were. So anyway, that is it for this video. I will see you in the next one. Bye.